Carl Jung explained, 9 signs your shadow no longer holds power over your energy. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the familiar landscape of consciousness shifts beneath your feet like sand disturbed by an underground river. You have lived, perhaps for decades, with a carefully constructed understanding of who you are, a persona polished to perfection, reflecting back to the world only those qualities deemed acceptable, worthy, lovable. But now, in this threshold moment, something stirs in the depths, something that has been waiting, patient as stone, for its time to emerge from the psychological underground where it has dwelt in exile. This is the moment Jung spoke of with such reverence, the Nigredo, that sacred blackening where the alchemists understood that transformation begins not with light, but with a willing descent into darkness. It is here, in this liminal space, between who you have been and who you are becoming, that the shadow reveals itself not as enemy, but as teacher, not as the monster you have projected onto others, but as the disowned parts of your own soul, seeking reunion with consciousness. Feel into this moment, this recognition that dawns like a reluctant sun through heavy clouds. You begin to sense that what you have spent lifetimes pushing away, the anger you were taught was unacceptable, the vulnerability you learned to armor against, the wildness you were told to civilize. These exiled aspects of self have not disappeared. They have simply grown powerful in the darkness, feeding on the energy you have poured into their suppression. Like shadows cast by a fire, the brighter you have tried to make your conscious personality, the darker and more pronounced these rejected aspects have become. But here, in this awakening, something fundamental shifts. The paradigm that has governed your relationship to these inner territories undergoes what Jung called an Antiodroia, that mysterious law by which everything eventually turns into its opposite. What was once approached with fear and resistance begins to call forth curiosity. What was once met with judgment begins to invite compassion. The very energy you have used to keep these aspects at bay becomes available for their integration. This is not a comfortable process. The ego, that protective structure of identity you have so carefully built, does not surrender its boundaries easily. It has served as the guardian of what feels safe, familiar, socially acceptable. To acknowledge the shadow means to admit that this carefully curated self-image is incomplete, not false, but partial. It means recognizing that the person you have presented to the world, and even to yourself, has been only one facet of a far more complex and mysterious totality. Consider the metaphor of the iceberg, so beloved by depth psychology. The conscious personality you have known floats above the waterline, visible and definable. But beneath the surface lies a vast underwater continent of psychic material, memories, potentials, instincts, creative forces that have been submerged beneath the threshold of awareness. The shadow is not separate from this larger self. It is the underwater portion of your own being, made invisible not by its absence but by the limitations of conscious vision. In this moment of awakening, you begin to sense the artificial nature of the division between light and dark within the psyche. Jung understood that the shadow is not evil in the moral sense, but simply that which has been rejected by the conscious attitude. If your family valued emotional restraint, then spontaneous feeling likely dwells in your shadow. If your culture prized rational thinking, then intuitive knowing may have been banished to the unconscious. If your environment demanded compliance, then rebellious independence probably lives in the psychological underground. The awakening begins when you recognize that these rejected qualities are not inherently destructive. They have become problematic only because they have been forced to operate outside the realm of conscious choice. Like any force in nature, they become dangerous only when dammed up, denied expression, forced into the darkness where they ferment and distort. The anger that might have served as healthy boundary setting becomes rage when suppressed. The sadness that could have deepened empathy becomes depression when disallowed. The sexual energy that might have flowed into creative passion becomes compulsive when shamed into hiding. This recognition brings with it a profound shift in the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Where once there was warfare, the conscious mind attempting to maintain control over the unruly forces of the psyche, there begins to emerge the possibility of dialogue. Jung spoke of this as the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to hold paradox and find a third way beyond the opposites. It is the function that allows you to be both strong and tender, both independent and connected, both serious and playful, without splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. But this integration requires something the ego often resists: a willingness to die to the familiar. The alchemists knew that before the golden wholeness could emerge, there must be a dissolution, a breaking down of the old structures to make space for something new. This is why the shadow work often begins with a kind of psychological crucifixion, where the carefully maintained self-image must be stretched beyond its comfortable limits to accommodate truths that no longer fit within its boundaries. The process mirrors the mythic journey of descent and return found in cultures worldwide. Persephone's abduction into the underworld, Inanna's journey to the land of the dead, Christ's descent into hell before resurrection, all point to this fundamental pattern of transformation through conscious suffering. The shadow work is your own descent into the psychological underworld, not to be destroyed by it, but to bring back the treasures that can only be found in the darkness. As this awakening deepens, you begin to notice how much energy has been bound up in the work of maintaining the split between acceptable and unacceptable aspects of self. The constant vigilance required to monitor your responses, to ensure you are presenting only approved qualities, to keep the unwanted parts carefully hidden. This has demanded tremendous psychic resources. Imagine the relief of a person who has been holding their breath underwater, finally breaking the surface. This is the felt sense as the energy once trapped in repression becomes available for conscious life. The shadow's emergence into awareness often begins with what Jung called contamination, moments when the carefully maintained conscious attitude is invaded by material from the unconscious. You find yourself unusually angry at a minor provocation, unexpectedly tearful at a sentimental song, strangely drawn to behaviors or people you would normally judge. These breakthroughs can be disturbing to the ego, but they are actually signs of healing. The psyche's attempt to restore balance by bringing the rejected material into consciousness. At first, these shadow contents may feel alien, as if they belong to someone else entirely. This is because they have been split off from conscious identification for so long that they seem foreign. The task of integration involves gradually recognizing these seemingly alien aspects as legitimate parts of your own psychological landscape. Like learning to recognize yourself in an old photograph where you appear almost unrecognizable, you begin to see the continuity between the shadow material and your conscious identity. This process is aided by what Jung called active imagination, the deliberate engagement with unconscious contents through dialogue, imagery, and symbolic expression. Rather than simply observing these shadow aspects from a distance, you begin to interact with them, to understand their motivations and needs. You might discover that the critical inner voice carries important standards and values, even if it has been expressing them harshly. You might find that the rebellious impulse contains vital creativity that has been stifled by excessive conformity. The awakening to the shadow as teacher rather than enemy fundamentally alters your relationship to psychological pain. Instead of viewing difficult emotions and unwanted impulses as problems to be solved or symptoms to be eliminated, You begin to approach them with the curiosity of an investigator and the compassion of a healer. What is this anger trying to protect? What need underlies this sadness? What creative potential is buried in this seemingly destructive impulse? This shift from pathologizing to honoring the shadow's messages marks a crucial threshold in the individuation process. Jung understood that the goal of psychological development is not the elimination of difficult material, but its integration into a larger wholeness. The shadow contains not only what seems negative, but also what Jung called the golden shadow, positive potentials that were rejected along with the negative ones. Perhaps your family discouraged pride, causing you to exile not only arrogance, but also healthy self-confidence. Perhaps your culture valued humility, leading you to disown not only boastfulness, but also the ability to acknowledge your genuine gifts. As the awakening deepens, you begin to recognize shadow material everywhere, in your dreams, in your projections onto others, in your unexplained attractions and aversions, in the quality of criticism you most despise when directed at you. The shadow becomes a constant companion in consciousness, no longer the feared enemy hiding in psychological darkness, but a trusted guide pointing toward the wholeness that lies beyond the comfortable limitations of persona and ego. This recognition brings with it a profound shift in your relationship to judgment, both of yourself and others. When you begin to see the shadow as carrying legitimate psychological material, rather than evidence of your fundamental inadequacy, the harsh inner critic begins to lose its power. When you recognize that everyone carries both light and shadow aspects, your capacity for compassion naturally expands. The energy once bound in self-attack and judgment of others becomes available for genuine understanding and authentic relationship. The awakening also transforms your relationship to perfectionism and the relentless drive to be good in the conventional sense. Jung recognized that the pursuit of moral perfection often creates its opposite. The very qualities we most fiercely reject in ourselves have a way of manifesting in shadow forms. The person who prides themselves on never being angry may become passive-aggressive. The one who insists on being always helpful may become manipulative. The one who maintains perfect self-control may find themselves periodically overwhelmed by compulsive behaviors. In recognizing the shadow as teacher, you begin to understand that psychological wholeness includes the capacity for the full spectrum of human experience, not as unconscious compulsions, but as conscious choices available when appropriate. You can access anger when boundaries need protection, sadness when loss requires grieving, fear when genuine danger threatens, desire when creative passion calls. These emotional capacities become allies rather than enemies when they are integrated into consciousness rather than banished to the shadow. This integration process requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to contain paradox without immediately rushing to resolve it through splitting or projection. You learn to be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and interdependent, both serious and playful. The rigid, either-or thinking that characterizes much of conventional consciousness gives way to the both and awareness that allows for genuine complexity. The awakening to shadow as teacher also transforms your relationship to your own mistakes and failures. Instead of seeing these as evidence of inadequacy, they become valuable information about the areas where integration is still needed. A sudden outburst of anger might reveal an unacknowledged boundary violation. An unexpected flood of tears might point to unprocessed grief. A compulsive behavior might indicate an unmet need seeking expression through the only channel available. As this process unfolds, you begin to experience what Jung called the relativization of the ego, the recognition that the conscious personality, while important, is not the totality of who you are. The ego becomes like a captain of a ship rather than the entire vessel, responsible for navigation but not mistaking itself for the whole journey. This shift allows for a more harmonious relationship between conscious and unconscious, where the ego serves as a conscious partner with the larger self rather than its fearful guardian. The shadow's transformation from enemy to teacher marks the beginning of what Jung considered the most important psychological work of the second half of life, the process of individuation. This is not individualism in the sense of selfish independence, but rather the development of your unique wholeness in service of both personal fulfillment and collective healing. As you integrate your own shadow material, you become less likely to project it onto others, contributing to the healing of the collective shadow that manifests in social problems, political polarization, and cultural conflicts. In this awakening, you begin to sense that the shadow work is not just personal healing, but also a form of service to the larger whole. Every person who does the work of integrating their rejected aspects contributes to the collective capacity for wholeness. Every individual who learns to hold their own contradictions with compassion adds to the world's capacity for complexity and nuance. Every person who transforms their inner critic into an inner counselor reduces the amount of unconscious judgment being projected into the collective atmosphere. This understanding brings a sense of sacred responsibility to the work of shadow integration. It is no longer just about personal happiness or psychological health, though these are natural byproducts, but about participating consciously in the evolution of human consciousness itself. Jung saw this as the individual's contribution to what he called the collective unconscious, that vast shared psychic substrate that connects all human beings. As this first phase of the journey concludes, you find yourself standing at the threshold of a great adventure. The recognition that darkness can be teacher rather than enemy has opened a door that can never be fully closed. The work of integration stretches ahead, challenging, transformative, and ultimately liberating. You have begun to sense that the very aspects of yourself you most feared to acknowledge may contain the keys to your most authentic expression and deepest fulfillment. The awakening is complete when you can look into the psychological mirror and see not a simple reflection of light, but the complex interplay of light and shadow that constitutes your full humanity. In this moment, you are ready for the deeper work of integration that lies ahead, armed with the revolutionary understanding that nothing in the human psyche is fundamentally alien or irredeemable. All can be welcomed home to consciousness, transformed through awareness and integrated into the magnificent complexity of your becoming self. The world begins to shimmer differently now, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, distorting the familiar landscape of your relationships and reactions. Where once you saw with absolute certainty the faults and shadows of others, their irritating habits, their obvious blind spots, their maddeningly predictable patterns, now something has shifted in the very mechanism of perception itself. The mirror through which you have viewed the world is beginning to crack, and through those hairline fractures, a different kind of light is streaming in. This is the dissolution of projection, that masterful psychological sleight of hand by which the psyche keeps its rejected contents at a safe distance by seeing them embodied in others rather than acknowledged within the self. Jung understood projection as one of the most fundamental and unconscious operations of the human mind, a protective mechanism that maintains the ego's sense of integrity by casting disowned aspects of the personality onto external figures. But now, in this phase of awakening, the projective mechanism is beginning to malfunction, and with its breakdown comes a profound reorganization of how you experience both yourself and the world around you. Consider how seamlessly this process has operated throughout your life. That colleague whose confidence you found so abrasive, could it be that your own disowned assertiveness was speaking to you through the vehicle of your irritation? That friend whose emotional volatility triggered such judgment in you, might your own carefully suppressed spontaneity have been calling for recognition through your criticism of their expressiveness? That authority figure whose apparent arrogance infuriated you, was it possible that your own unacknowledged leadership qualities were seeking integration through the medium of your outrage? The recognition arrives not as an intellectual understanding, but as a visceral knowing, a felt shift in the body's response to those external triggers that once sent you into immediate reactivity. The familiar surge of righteousness begins to pause, creating a space between stimulus and response where something new can emerge. In that pause, you begin to sense the strange magnetism that draws your attention so powerfully to certain qualities in others, not because these qualities are objectively more prominent in them than in anyone else, but because they resonate with the very frequencies you have banished from your own conscious expression. This is the beginning of what Jung called withdrawing projections, a process that fundamentally alters your relationship to the external world by bringing home the disowned parts of yourself that you have been encountering through others. It is like suddenly realizing that what you took to be windows offering views of other landscapes were actually mirrors reflecting aspects of your own inner territory back to you. The shock of this recognition can be profound, to discover that much of what you experienced as out there was actually in here, seeking acknowledgement and integration. The process unfolds gradually, like morning mist lifting from a lake, to reveal the shoreline that was always there beneath the vapor. You begin to notice the peculiar intensity of your reactions to certain people, the way specific behaviors or qualities seem to grab your attention with hooks of fascination or repulsion, where once these reactions felt obviously justified by the objective awfulness or wonderfulness of what you were observing. Now you begin to sense the subjective component, the way your own psychic material is being activated by encountering its reflection in the external world. The withdrawal of projections requires a fundamental reorientation of attention, a turning from the outward focus of blame, admiration, criticism, or idealization toward the inward recognition of what these external figures are constellating within your own psyche. It is like learning to read your emotional reactions as a kind of internal weather report, indicating not just what is happening out there, but what is stirring in here in response to those external conditions. This shift often begins with what feels like a betrayal by your own perceptual apparatus. The colleague you were so certain was narcissistic begins to blur at the edges as you recognize your own disowned need for recognition. The friend you admired for their fearless authenticity becomes more complex as you acknowledge your own suppressed courage seeking expression. The family member whose pessimism drove you to distraction reveals itself as a mirror for your own carefully hidden doubts and concerns about life's difficulties. The dissolution of projection can feel deeply disorienting because it challenges one of the ego's primary organizing principles, the clear distinction between self and other, between what belongs to you and what belongs to them. Jung recognized this boundary confusion as a natural part of the individuation process, a temporary dissolution of familiar categories that must occur before a more differentiated and conscious relationship can emerge, like the alchemical solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The old structures of perception must be dissolved before new ones can form. As the projective mechanism begins to fail, you enter what might be called the confusion of ownership. Emotional reactions that once seemed clearly caused by external circumstances now reveal their mixed origins, part response to genuine external conditions, part activation of your own unconscious material. The anger you felt at someone's inconsideration carries within it not only a legitimate response to their behavior, but also your own disowned selfishness seeking recognition. The admiration you felt for someone's creativity contains not only genuine appreciation, but also your own artistic potentials calling for acknowledgement. This confusion, while uncomfortable, is actually a sign of progress, evidence that the artificial boundaries between projected and non-projected material are becoming more permeable. Jung understood that consciousness develops not through maintaining rigid categories, but through learning to hold complexity and paradox, without immediately rushing to resolve them through splitting or projection. The ability to contain the question, is this mine or theirs, without immediately needing to answer it, represents a significant evolution in psychological sophistication. The withdrawal of projections often precipitates what Jung called the return of the repressed. As the disowned material is no longer safely contained in external figures, it begins to press for recognition and integration within your own psyche. This can manifest as sudden upwellings of previously unfamiliar emotions, unexpected attractions to new activities or ways of being, or strange dreams filled with figures who embody the qualities you have been projecting onto others. The psyche is calling home its exiled aspects, and this return can feel overwhelming to a consciousness not yet prepared to accommodate its own complexity. The process requires developing what might be called projective literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language through which your unconscious material presents itself in your reactions to others. Like learning to interpret dreams, you begin to understand that your intense responses to external figures often carry messages about your own developmental needs and unlived potentials. The qualities that most irritate you in others often point to shadow aspects seeking integration. The qualities you most idealize in others often indicate golden shadow potentials awaiting development. This recognition transforms your relationship to conflict and attraction in profound ways. Where once an interpersonal difficulty meant focusing entirely on changing the other person's behavior, now you begin to ask what internal work is being called for by the external situation. Where once falling in love meant being overwhelmed by the other person's wonderful qualities, now you begin to recognize the beloved as activating your own unlived potentials for love, beauty, and creative expression. The external world becomes a gymnasium for internal development, rather than a battlefield where you must defend against or acquire external resources. The dissolution of projection also fundamentally alters your relationship to authority and power. Those external figures onto whom you have projected either ultimate authority or complete powerlessness begin to reveal themselves as carriers of your own disowned capacity for leadership and influence. The boss you experienced as omnipotent was holding your own unacknowledged executive abilities. The public figure you saw as completely corrupt was carrying your own disowned capacity for wielding power. As these projections are withdrawn, you begin to encounter your own authentic relationship to authority, neither inflated nor deflated, but grounded in a realistic assessment of your actual capacities and limitations. This process often involves mourning the loss of the simplified world that projection creates. It was easier when bad qualities clearly belonged to them and good qualities clearly belonged to us. It was more comfortable when your heroes could carry your unlived potentials and your villains could embody your rejected aspects. The withdrawal of projections means accepting a more complex world, where everyone, including yourself, carries both light and shadow, where no one is purely victim or perpetrator, savior or devil. This complexity can feel overwhelming to a consciousness accustomed to clear moral categories, but it is the price of psychological maturity. The energy that was once bound in projection begins to become available for authentic relationship and creative expression. Instead of using others as repositories for disowned aspects of yourself, you can meet them as separate individuals with their own unique gifts and limitations. Instead of seeking completion through finding external figures who embody your unlived potentials, you can begin the work of developing these capacities within yourself. The external world becomes less of a projection screen and more of a field for genuine encounter and mutual influence. This transformation often manifests as a shift in the quality of your attention, where once you were unconsciously scanning the environment for figures onto whom you could project your disowned material, now you begin to develop what might be called non-projective seeing, the ability to perceive others with curiosity rather than immediate categorization, with spaciousness rather than reactive judgment. This doesn't mean becoming passive or losing discernment, but rather developing a more sophisticated form of perception that can simultaneously appreciate others' unique qualities while remaining aware of your own internal responses. The withdrawal of projections also affects your relationship to collective and cultural shadows. Those groups of people you most feared or despised often carried projections of your own disowned tribal, cultural, or instinctual aspects. As these projections are withdrawn, you begin to encounter your own capacity for both individual excellence and group belonging, both civilized refinement and primitive vitality. The energy once bound in cultural and political projection becomes available for genuine engagement with social issues based on conscious values rather than unconscious psychological dynamics. The process deepens your capacity for what Jung called differentiation, the ability to distinguish between your own psychological material and that which genuinely belongs to others. This skill develops gradually through practice and attention, like learning to distinguish between different musical instruments in a complex symphony. You begin to recognize the particular signature or flavor of your own projective material versus your authentic responses to external conditions. Your anger begins to feel different when it carries your own disowned aggression versus when it represents a legitimate response to boundary violations. As projections are withdrawn, your dreams often become more personally relevant and less populated by external figures carrying symbolic material. The energy that was being expressed through projection begins to appear more directly in dream images, creative expressions, and spontaneous internal dialogues. The psyche no longer needs to use external figures as intermediaries for internal communication. It can speak to you more directly through symptoms, dreams, and the subtle movements of attention and energy throughout your daily life. The dissolution of projection ultimately serves what Jung understood as the fundamental goal of individuation, the development of a more authentic and differentiated relationship to both self and world. As you cease using others as repositories for your disowned psychological material, you become more available for genuine relationship based on curiosity, appreciation, and mutual influence rather than unconscious psychological dynamics. As you reclaim the energy that was bound in projection, you have more resources available for creative expression and authentic self-development. This phase of the journey concludes with a profound shift in the locus of responsibility and creative power. Where once your well-being seemed dependent on the behavior and qualities of external figures, now you begin to sense that your primary work lies in the conscious relationship to your own inner life. Where once change seemed to require fixing or acquiring something outside yourself, now you recognize that transformation happens through the integration of previously disowned aspects of your own psyche. The external world remains important, but it no longer carries the burden of completing or healing what can only be addressed through internal work. The mirror has shattered, but what emerges from its destruction is not fragmentation but clarity, the clear seeing that recognizes both the legitimate otherness of external figures and the responsibility to integrate what belongs to your own process of becoming. In this clarity, relationship becomes possible in a new way, based not on projection and unconscious exchange, but on the conscious meeting of two individuals who are each doing the work of becoming whole. In the depths of your being, something ancient stirs, not the familiar emotions you have learned to manage, suppress, or indulge, but the primordial forces from which all feeling springs. These are the emotions that have lived in exile, the ones too intense for polite society, too raw for your carefully constructed persona, too threatening to the image of who you believed yourself to be. They have been the shadow's most faithful servants, erupting at inconvenient moments to remind you of energies that refuse to be civilized out of existence. But now, in this deepening phase of integration, these very forces begin to reveal their true nature, not as enemies of consciousness, but as its most essential allies. Jung understood emotions as the bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, carrying vital information from the deeper layers of the psyche to the surface of awareness. Yet most of us have been taught to relate to our emotional life as if it were a wild animal that must be either caged or eliminated entirely. We learn to fear our anger, to be ashamed of our sadness, to distrust our joy, to suppress our fear. In doing so, we cut ourselves off from the very messengers that could guide us toward wholeness, leaving us stranded in the thin atmosphere of purely rational consciousness, while the rich underground rivers of feeling flow unacknowledged beneath our feet. The transformation begins when you recognize that emotions are not random eruptions of biochemical chaos, but purposeful communications from the wisdom of your entire being. That sudden surge of rage that seems to come from nowhere, it carries information about boundaries that have been violated, values that have been trampled, aspects of self that have been dismissed or attacked. The unexpected flood of grief that overwhelms you at a seemingly minor loss. It speaks of accumulated sorrows that have been stored in the body's memory, waiting for a safe moment to be witnessed and honored. The anxiety that grips you before important transitions, it voices the soul's natural wisdom about the magnitude of change and the need for careful attention to what is emerging. This shift from viewing emotions as problems to be solved to recognizing them as messages to be decoded represents a fundamental revolution in your relationship to your own inner life. Instead of asking, "How can I get rid of this feeling?" you begin to inquire, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" Instead of seeing emotional intensity as evidence of instability or weakness, you begin to recognize it as the psyche's wave, emphasizing the importance of what needs to be attended to. Like learning a new language, you gradually develop fluency in the symbolic vocabulary of the emotional body. The process often begins with the emotions that have been most banished from consciousness, those feelings that were met with punishment, rejection, or abandonment when you first dared to express them. Perhaps it was anger that was forbidden in your childhood home, forcing this essential life force to find expression through passive aggression, chronic illness, or sudden explosions that seemed to come from nowhere. Perhaps it was sadness that was seen as weakness, driving your grief underground where it fermented into depression or numbness. Perhaps it was joy that was considered dangerous or inappropriate, causing your natural celebration to be compressed into socially acceptable forms that left you feeling hollow and disconnected from your own vitality. As these exiled emotions begin to emerge from the shadow, They often arrive with the intensity of forces that have been dammed up for years or even decades. The anger may feel volcanic, the sadness oceanic, the fear all-consuming. This intensity can be alarming to a consciousness accustomed to emotional moderation, but it is actually a sign of healing. The psyche's attempt to discharge accumulated energy that has been trapped in the unconscious, like a river whose flow has been blocked by debris. Once the obstruction is removed, there may be an initial flood before the natural rhythm of flow can be restored. The key to working with these intense emotional emergences lies in developing what might be called emotional presence, the capacity to be with strong feelings without either being overwhelmed by them or immediately rushing to action to discharge their energy. This requires learning to distinguish between feeling an emotion and being possessed by it. When you are possessed by an emotion, it uses you as its vehicle, compelling reactions and behaviors that you may later regret. When you are present with an emotion, you become its conscious host, allowing it to move through you while maintaining your capacity for choice about how to respond. This distinction is crucial for understanding how emotions transform from tyrants to allies. When emotions operate from the shadow, they possess rather than inform. They drive compulsive behaviors, reactive patterns, and unconscious dynamics that often create the very outcomes they seek to prevent. Shadow anger attacks others, driving them away, when what it really wants is connection and respect. Shadow sadness collapses into victimhood, pushing away the very support it desperately needs. Shadow fear creates rigid control patterns that prevent the very growth and expansion that would naturally dissolve the fear. But when emotions are brought into conscious relationship, they reveal their underlying intelligence and purpose. Anger shows itself as the guardian of boundaries and the defender of what matters most to you. Sadness reveals itself as the great softener, breaking open the heart to receive love and connection at deeper levels. Fear emerges as wisdom about genuine dangers and the appropriate preparation needed for life's challenges. Joy becomes the celebration of life's abundance and the magnet that draws you toward experiences and relationships that nourish your authentic nature. This transformation requires developing what Jung called the feeling function, not just the ability to have emotions, but the capacity to discriminate between different qualities and meanings of emotional experience. You begin to recognize the difference between clean anger and contaminated rage, between appropriate sadness and self-pitying depression, between realistic concern and anxious catastrophizing, between genuine joy and manic inflation. This discrimination allows you to trust your emotional guidance system while maintaining discernment about how to express and act upon what you feel. The process is aided by what might be called emotional archaeology, the patient work of uncovering the original contexts and meanings that shaped your relationship to different feelings. You begin to trace the roots of your emotional patterns back to their origins, understanding how early experiences created the templates through which you learn to interpret and respond to emotional energy. That harsh inner critic that attacks you whenever you feel angry may be carrying the voice of a parent who couldn't tolerate your childhood rage. The numbness that descends whenever sadness arises may be protecting you from overwhelming losses that were too much for your younger self to fully process. As you uncover these original patterns, you can begin to separate past conditioning from present reality, allowing your emotional responses to update themselves based on your current capacity and circumstances, rather than remaining frozen in childhood adaptations. The anger that once had to be completely suppressed for survival can now be expressed appropriately when boundaries need protection. The sadness that once threatened to overwhelm your immature nervous system can now be welcomed as a natural response to loss and a pathway to deeper compassion. This emotional integration profoundly affects your relationships with others. When your emotions are operating from the shadow, they tend to create unconscious entanglements. You become angry at others for triggering your suppressed rage, sad in response to their unexpressed grief, anxious about their unacknowledged fears. But as you develop conscious relationship to your own emotional life, you become less reactive to others' emotional states, while more genuinely available for empathy and support. You can feel compassion for someone's pain without being dragged into their drama, witness someone's anger without taking it personally, celebrate someone's joy without feeling diminished by comparison. The transformation also affects your relationship to your body, which is the primary vessel through which emotional energy moves and expresses itself. Many people live in a constant state of tension, their musculature chronically contracted against the flow of unwanted feelings. As emotions are welcomed back into consciousness, this physical armoring begins to soften. Shoulders that have been raised against anticipated attack can relax. Jaws that have been clenched against unwanted words can unclench. Chests that have been closed against heartbreak can begin to open to both pain and pleasure. This physical dimension of emotional integration often involves what Wilhelm Reich called character armor, the chronic muscular patterns that develop to contain and control emotional energy. As these patterns are recognized and gradually released, the body's natural capacity for emotional flow is restored. Breath deepens, movement becomes more fluid, and the whole organism becomes more available for the full spectrum of human feeling. The body reveals itself as not just the container for emotions, but as their primary intelligence, knowing instinctively how to process and integrate emotional energy when not interfered with by mental resistance. The integration of shadow emotions also transforms your creative expression. Feelings that have been suppressed often carry tremendous creative potential. The anger may fuel passionate advocacy. The sadness may deepen artistic expression. The fear may sharpen discernment and attention to detail. The joy may inspire celebration and play. As these energies are no longer bound up in suppression or unconscious eruption, they become available for conscious creative use. Many people discover that their most authentic creative work emerges not from their light and acceptable emotions, but from the raw materials that have been buried in the shadow. This phase of the journey often involves what might be called emotional composting, the process by which old, stuck emotional material is gradually transformed into fertile ground for new growth. Like organic matter that has been trapped underground, these buried feelings may initially emerge in concentrated and sometimes overwhelming forms. But as they are witnessed, honored, and allowed to move through consciousness, they decompose into the rich soil from which creativity, wisdom, and authentic relationship can grow. The transformation of emotions from tyrants to allies also fundamentally alters your relationship to power and choice. When emotions operate from the shadow, they often feel like forces that happen to you. You are overcome by anger, consumed by sadness, paralyzed by fear. But as they are integrated into consciousness, emotions reveal themselves as energies you can work with consciously. You can choose how to channel your anger into effective action, how to allow your sadness to open your heart, how to use your fear as information for wise decision-making. This doesn't mean controlling emotions in the old, suppressive way, but rather developing what might be called emotional Aikido, the ability to work with emotional energy rather than against it, redirecting its flow in ways that serve your conscious intentions while honoring its essential nature. Like a skilled martial artist who uses an opponent's energy to achieve their own purposes, you learn to collaborate with your emotions rather than fighting them or being overwhelmed by them. The process deepens your appreciation for what Jung called the union of opposites. You begin to recognize that emotional maturity doesn't mean choosing between different feelings, but learning to hold seemingly contradictory emotions simultaneously. You can be both strong and tender, both independent and connected, both serious and playful. The rigid either-or thinking that characterizes much of conventional emotional life gives way to the both and awareness that allows for genuine emotional complexity. As this integration progresses, you begin to experience what might be called emotional authenticity, the alignment between what you feel, what you express, and what you do. The exhausting work of maintaining facades that hide your true emotional state begins to dissolve. Energy that was once bound up in emotional suppression or performance becomes available for genuine presence and creative expression. Relationships become more real and satisfying when based on authentic emotional communication rather than strategic emotional management. The culmination of this phase occurs when you recognize that emotions are not just personal experiences, but connections to the larger patterns of life itself. Your anger connects you to the universal principle of protection and boundary setting. Your sadness links you to the cosmic process of letting go and making space for new life. Your fear attunes you to the wisdom that guides all creatures in navigating danger and uncertainty. Your joy resonates with the fundamental creative impulse that moves through all existence. In this recognition, emotions reveal their transpersonal dimension. They are not just psychological phenomena, but expressions of the same energies that move through nature, relationships, and the larger cosmos. You begin to sense yourself as part of a vast emotional ecosystem where your individual feelings contribute to and are nourished by the larger emotional life of the world. The shadow emotions that once seemed so personal and problematic reveal themselves as your unique participation in the universal dance of feeling that animates all life. The transformation is complete when emotions become what they were always meant to be, faithful allies in the service of your becoming, wise counselors guiding you toward wholeness, and bridges connecting you to the deeper currents of life that flow through and beyond individual consciousness. In their company, the journey toward integration continues with a new quality of energy and intelligence, supported by forces that were once feared as enemies but are now recognized as essential companions on the path to authentic selfhood. In the quietest moments when the noise of the world subsides and you turn your attention inward, there it is, that voice. It knows you better than anyone else ever could, for it has been your constant companion since childhood, cataloging every mistake, every inadequacy, every moment when you fell short of some impossible standard. It speaks with intimate authority about your failures, your limitations, your fundamental unworthiness. This is the inner critic, perhaps the shadow's most sophisticated and persistent manifestation, the internalized chorus of every judgment you ever received, now operating with autonomous power within the depths of your own psyche. But here, in this deepening phase of shadow integration, something miraculous begins to occur. That harsh, relentless voice that has driven you toward perfectionism and paralyzed you with shame begins to undergo a transformation so profound it seems almost alchemical in nature. The very quality that made it so devastating, its intimate knowledge of your vulnerabilities, begins to reveal itself as its greatest gift. For who better to guide you toward wholeness than the one who knows exactly where the work needs to be done? Jung understood the inner critic as a complex psychological structure that develops in response to early experiences of conditional acceptance and societal demands for conformity. In its original form, it served a protective function, helping the developing ego learn what was acceptable and what was dangerous in the family and cultural environment. But like many protective mechanisms, it often outlives its usefulness, becoming a tyrannical internal regime that continues to enforce childhood rules long after the original context has changed. What once protected the vulnerable child by ensuring compliance now imprisons the adult in patterns of self-attack that prevent the very growth and authenticity that would lead to genuine fulfillment. The transformation begins when you recognize that the inner critic is not your enemy, but a part of your own psyche that has been doing what it believes is necessary work, albeit with tools that are no longer appropriate for your current situation. Like a medieval physician who continues to prescribe bloodletting for every ailment, the inner critic applies the same crude remedy of harsh judgment to every situation, not out of malice, but out of a limited repertoire of responses. This recognition marks the beginning of a new relationship, one based on understanding rather than warfare, dialogue rather than suppression. The first step in this transformation involves what might be called critic archaeology, the patient work of uncovering the origins and original intentions of this internal voice. As you begin to listen more carefully to its specific criticisms and concerns, you often discover that it carries the accumulated voices of parents, teachers, religious authorities, and cultural figures who shaped your early understanding of what was required for acceptance and safety. That voice that tells you you're lazy may be carrying your father's work ethic, attempting to motivate you through the only method it knows. That voice that insists you're selfish may be echoing your mother's emphasis on putting others first, trying to protect you from the rejection she feared would come from asserting your own needs. This archaeological process reveals something profound about the inner critic's true nature. It is not fundamentally destructive, but profoundly protective. It developed to help you navigate a world that seemed to demand constant vigilance and self-improvement for survival. Every harsh judgment it levels carries within it an underlying concern for your well-being, albeit expressed through methods that have become counterproductive. The voice that attacks your body is trying to protect you from rejection based on appearance. The voice that criticizes your creative expressions is attempting to shield you from the vulnerability of being seen. The voice that judges your emotions is working to maintain the psychological safety that came from emotional conformity. As you begin to recognize these protective intentions, something shifts in your relationship to the critical voice. Instead of experiencing it as a hostile foreign entity that has invaded your consciousness, you begin to sense it as a wounded part of your own psyche that is using the only methods it knows to try to keep you safe. This recognition naturally evokes compassion, not just for yourself, but for this internal figure that has been working so tirelessly, if ineffectively, on your behalf. The energy that was once bound up in self-attack begins to transform into self-understanding. The transformation deepens when you begin to dialogue with the critic, rather than simply enduring its monologues. Like any relationship that has been stuck in dysfunctional patterns, this internal relationship can change when communication becomes two-way rather than one-directional. You might begin by acknowledging the critic's concerns. I hear that you're worried I'll be rejected if I'm not perfect. I understand that you're trying to protect me from pain. This simple recognition often has a profound effect on the critic's tone and intensity. It has been trying to get your attention for years, and being truly heard begins to soften its desperate urgency. From this foundation of mutual recognition, you can begin to negotiate new agreements about how this protective function might be served more effectively. The critic's harsh methodology can be gradually replaced with more sophisticated approaches that serve the same underlying concerns. Instead of attacking your appearance, the critic might evolve into a voice that encourages healthy self-care. Instead of judging your creative work as inadequate, it might become a discerning inner artist, that helps you refine your expressions while maintaining compassion for your developing skills. Instead of criticizing your emotions as inappropriate, it might transform into an inner counselor that helps you understand and express your feelings more effectively. This evolution requires patience and consistent practice, like training a horse that has been broken through harsh methods to respond to gentler guidance. The critic has developed its patterns over decades and will not abandon them quickly or easily. But as you consistently respond to its concerns with understanding rather than defensiveness, and as you demonstrate that you can maintain appropriate standards without self-attack, the critic begins to trust that its protective function can be served through collaboration rather than domination. The process often involves what might be called inner critic integration rituals, conscious practices that honor the critic's positive intentions while establishing new boundaries around its expression. You might create specific times for self-reflection and assessment, providing the critic with appropriate venues for its concerns while preventing it from launching surprise attacks throughout the day. You might develop internal agreements about how feedback will be given, perhaps requiring that all criticism be accompanied by specific suggestions for improvement, or that negative observations be balanced with acknowledgement of strengths and progress. As the relationship evolves, you begin to experience what Jung called the discriminating function, the ability to distinguish between useful feedback and destructive attack, between appropriate standards and impossible perfectionism, between genuine areas for growth and imaginary inadequacies. The critic's voice becomes more refined and sophisticated, offering nuanced observations rather than crude condemnations. Where it once spoke in absolutes, "You always mess up," "You never do anything right," it begins to offer specific and actionable feedback. This part of your presentation could be stronger. You might want to consider how your tone affected that conversation. This discrimination also extends to recognizing when the critic is carrying projections from others rather than expressing your own authentic values and standards. Much of what passes for inner criticism is actually the internalized voices of external authorities, whose values may not align with your true nature and goals. As you develop more discernment, you can begin to separate what belongs to your own developmental process from what belongs to others' expectations and judgments that you have unconsciously absorbed. The energy once bound in conforming to alien standards becomes available for developing your own authentic criteria for growth and excellence. The transformation profoundly affects your relationship to mistakes and failures. The inner critic's original approach treats any error as evidence of fundamental inadequacy, leading to shame spirals that prevent learning and growth. But as the critic evolves into an inner wisdom figure, mistakes become valuable information rather than personal condemnations. You begin to develop what might be called failure literacy, the ability to extract useful feedback from disappointing outcomes without attacking your basic worth and potential. This shift allows for the kind of risk-taking and experimentation that genuine growth requires, since the fear of internal attack no longer paralyzes creative action. The evolved inner voice also begins to demonstrate qualities that were always latent within the critical function, but were obscured by its harsh methodology. You discover that beneath the critic's attacks lies a profound commitment to your highest potential, a fierce dedication to helping you become the best version of yourself. This dedication, once freed from destructive expression, becomes one of your greatest internal resources, an inner coach that combines high standards with deep compassion, challenging you to grow while maintaining unwavering faith in your capacity to meet those challenges. This transformation often reveals what might be called the wisdom hidden in standards. The inner critic's insistence on excellence, once freed from its punitive methodology, shows itself as a connection to the archetypal function of discernment and refinement. Like the master craftsperson who can see the potential beauty hidden within raw materials, the evolved critic becomes an internal artist that can envision your highest possibilities while maintaining patience with your developmental process. It learns to hold the tension between what you are and what you might become without collapsing that tension through either self-attack or complacency. The process also affects your relationship to external authority and feedback. When your inner critic operated from the shadow, it often made you hypersensitive to others' opinions, desperately seeking approval to quiet internal criticism or defensively rejecting feedback to protect against additional attack. But as the internal relationship becomes more conscious and collaborative, you develop greater resilience and discernment in relation to external input. You can receive constructive criticism without being devastated, and you can maintain your own standards without being dependent on others' validation. This internal evolution has profound effects on your creative expression and professional development. The critic's original function, to prevent you from making mistakes that might lead to rejection, often resulted in creative paralysis where the fear of not being perfect prevented any expression at all. But as the critic transforms into a collaborative partner in your creative process, it begins to serve excellence rather than inhibiting it. You can begin projects without having them perfectly formed in advance, knowing that your inner wisdom will help you refine and improve them through the natural process of creation and revision. The transformation also deepens your capacity for what Jung called moral imagination, the ability to hold complex ethical considerations without collapsing into rigid rules or moral relativism. The evolved inner voice becomes capable of nuanced moral reasoning that takes into account context, intention, and consequences, rather than applying crude categories of right and wrong. This sophistication allows for more authentic ethical decision-making based on wisdom rather than fear of judgment. As the integration deepens, you begin to recognize the inner critic's transformation as a microcosm of the larger individuation process. The harsh internal voices that once seemed like enemies reveal themselves as allies in disguise, carrying important functions that needed to be refined rather than eliminated. This recognition extends to other challenging aspects of the psyche. What seems destructive often carries constructive potential that is waiting to be recognized and properly channeled. The inner critic's evolution becomes a template for working with other shadow aspects, showing how patient understanding and compassionate dialogue can transform even the most seemingly hostile internal voices into collaborative partners. The culmination of this process occurs when the inner critic reveals its transpersonal dimension, its connection to the archetypal function of wisdom and discernment that exists beyond personal psychology. You begin to sense that your internal capacity for discrimination and refinement is your unique participation in the universal principles that guide the evolution of consciousness itself. The harsh judge becomes a wise counselor, the attacking enemy becomes a devoted ally, and the voice that once paralyzed growth becomes the very force that guides your continued evolution toward wholeness. In this transformed state, the inner voice operates from what might be called compassionate discernment, maintaining high standards while offering unwavering support for your efforts to meet them. It can see clearly what needs attention without attacking what is not yet developed. It can hold your highest potential without condemning your current limitations. It becomes the internal embodiment of the wise teacher who combines clear seeing with profound love, challenging you to grow while never doubting your fundamental worthiness and capacity for transformation. The inner critic's evolution from harsh judge to wise counselor represents one of the most profound victories in the shadow integration process. It demonstrates the possibility of transforming even the most entrenched psychological patterns through conscious relationship and compassionate understanding. In its reformed state, this inner voice becomes not just a personal resource, but a contribution to the collective healing of the harsh internal voices that plague so much of humanity. Each individual who accomplishes this internal transformation adds to the world's capacity for self-compassion and constructive self-reflection, modeling a way of internal relationship that supports growth while maintaining dignity and basic worthiness. The journey continues, but now you are accompanied by an inner ally whose intimacy with your psychology serves not the cause of attack, but the purpose of authentic development, whose knowledge of your vulnerabilities becomes the foundation for targeted growth, and whose reformed voice becomes a constant reminder that even the harshest aspects of the psyche can be transformed through the patient alchemy of consciousness and love. There comes a moment in the great work of becoming when the very ground beneath your understanding shifts, when the rigid architecture of who you thought you were begins to dissolve into something far more fluid, far more alive. You have walked through the valley of your own shadow, have touched the places within yourself that once seemed untouchable, and now you find yourself standing at the threshold of a profound recognition. What you once saw as contradiction is, in truth, completion. This is the gift of an Antiodroia, Jung's luminous insight into the psyche's eternal dance toward balance. It is not merely a concept to be understood, but a living reality to be inhabited, a recognition that the opposites within you are not enemies locked in eternal warfare, but partners in an ancient choreography of wholeness. The very tensions that once tore you apart now reveal themselves as the dynamic forces that hold you together. Consider the way a river moves, how it carves its path not by avoiding the rocks, but by flowing around them, over them, through the spaces between them. The water does not fight the stone, it embraces it, uses its resistance as a guide, transforms obstacle into opportunity. This is the wisdom of an Antiodroia, that opposition is not obstruction but orientation, that what resists us often reveals to us the very direction our soul wishes to travel. In the beginning, you lived as though life were a series of either-or choices, as though each decision required the banishment of its alternative. You believed that to choose strength meant rejecting vulnerability, that to embrace joy meant denying sorrow, that to love meant never feeling anger. But the shadow's integration has taught you a different grammar, a more nuanced language of the soul. You have learned that the heart is large enough to hold contradictions, that consciousness is spacious enough to embrace paradox. The energy that once churned in internal civil war now flows like a mighty river finding the sea. Where you once felt the exhausting tension of trying to be only one thing, only good, only strong, only rational, only loving, you now feel the expansive relief of being allowed to be everything you are. The light in you does not diminish the darkness. The darkness does not overcome the light. They dance together like lovers who have learned that their differences are not flaws to be corrected, but gifts to be celebrated. Think of how a flame contains both creation and destruction, how it illuminates by consuming, how it warms by transforming. There is no contradiction here, only the natural expression of fire's essential nature. So it is with you. Your anger is not separate from your love. It is love defending itself, love clarifying its boundaries, love refusing to be diminished. Your sadness is not the opposite of your joy. It is joy's depth, joy's capacity to be touched by life's beauty and fragility. Your fear is not the enemy of your courage. It is courage's companion, the very sensitivity that makes bravery possible. This recognition transforms everything. The internal prosecutor who once demanded that you choose sides in every psychological conflict begins to dissolve. The harsh judge who insisted that every feeling be justified, every impulse be pure, every thought be acceptable. This tyrant of the inner world loses its power when you realize that justification is not required for wholeness. You are not on trial. You never were. In place of the old either-or consciousness arises a new way of being, a both-and awareness that can hold multiplicity without fragmentation. You discover that you can be deeply spiritual and utterly human, profoundly wise and beautifully foolish, completely self-contained and entirely interdependent. These are not contradictions to be resolved, but polarities to be inhabited, the very tensions that give your life its distinctive music. The persona, that carefully crafted mask you once wore to meet the world's expectations, begins to soften and breathe. No longer rigid, no longer false, it becomes permeable, flexible, responsive. You realize that the persona was never meant to be a prison, but a bridge, not a disguise, but a doorway between your inner world and outer expression. When the shadow is integrated, the persona can finally relax into authenticity because there is nothing left to hide, nothing left to disown. You find yourself able to be professional and passionate in the same conversation, serious and playful in the same moment, confident and uncertain in the same breath. The old fear that showing one aspect of yourself might negate another dissolves like morning frost in sunlight. You begin to understand that complexity is not confusion, that multifaceted does not mean false, that containing contradictions is not the same as being contradictory. The unconscious, no longer split from consciousness by the sword of judgment, begins to offer its treasures more freely. Dreams become less cryptic, intuitions more accessible, creative impulses more natural. The psyche's natural wisdom, always present but often blocked by the rigid defenses of one-sided consciousness, begins to flow like water through previously dammed channels. In relationships, this integration brings a profound shift. You no longer need others to be simple, to be only one thing, to fit into neat categories that make you comfortable. You can appreciate their complexity because you have learned to appreciate your own. You can hold space for their contradictions because you have learned to hold space for yours. Love deepens when it no longer requires perfection, when it can embrace the full spectrum of human experience. The marriage of opposites within your own psyche becomes a template for how you engage with the world. You can be firm and flexible, direct and diplomatic, independent and collaborative. You can lead and follow, teach and learn, give and receive, often in the same interaction, sometimes in the same breath. This fluidity is not inconsistency. It is the natural responsiveness of a consciousness that is no longer defended against itself. You begin to see how the culture around you suffers from the very splitting you have learned to heal. Everywhere you look, you see the desperate attempt to be only one thing, only successful, only happy, only right, only good. You witness the exhaustion that comes from trying to maintain impossible purities, the violence that erupts when projected shadows meet, the loneliness that follows from the banishment of whole aspects of human experience. But you also begin to see the possibility, the potential that exists when even one person learns to embrace their own opposites. You become a bridge between worlds, a translator between different languages of being, a living example that contradiction can coexist with coherence, that wholeness does not require perfection. The creative force within you awakens with new vigor, no longer constrained by the need to express only acceptable thoughts or beautiful feelings. Your creativity becomes wild, honest, surprising. You discover that your most powerful expressions often emerge from the marriage of your light and dark, your hope and despair, your certainty and doubt. The art you create, the words you speak, the love you offer, all of it becomes more authentic because it includes more of who you are. You realize that this embrace of opposites is not a destination but a way of traveling, not a problem solved but a mystery lived. Each day brings new opportunities to practice holding paradox, to choose both and over either or, to find the third way that honors the truth of each apparent contradiction. Sometimes you succeed gracefully, sometimes you stumble back into old patterns of splitting and judgment. But even the stumbling becomes part of the dance, another opportunity to practice the radical acceptance that an Antiodroia requires. In quiet moments, you feel the deep rest that comes from no longer having to maintain impossible positions, no longer having to defend against half of your own experience. There is a profound peace in accepting what has always been true, that you are vast enough to contain multitudes, complex enough to defy simple categorization, dynamic enough to be different things at different times, and sometimes many things at once. The shadow you once feared becomes your ally. The light you once clung to becomes just one color in a full spectrum. You learn to navigate by different stars, not the rigid constellations of should and should not, but the fluid galaxies of what is and what might be. You discover that home is not a place of perfect consistency, but a state of comfortable paradox, a spacious acceptance of your own magnificent contradictions. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the transcendent function, not transcendence as escape from the human condition, but transcendence as the capacity to hold the human condition in all its glorious impossibility. You do not rise above your contradictions. You learn to dance with them. You do not resolve your paradoxes. You learn to inhabit them with grace. The journey continues, but the quality of the traveling has fundamentally changed. You walk now not as a divided soul seeking unity, but as an integrated being learning to express wholeness in an endlessly creative variety of ways. Each step reveals new facets of the jewel you are, new ways to honor both the darkness and the light, new possibilities for what it means to be fully, authentically, paradoxically human. In embracing your opposites, you have not lost yourself. You have found yourself. In accepting your contradictions, you have not become confused. You have become complete. In making paradox your home, you have not abandoned truth. You have discovered a truth large enough to hold everything you are, everything you have been, and everything you are still becoming. This is the gift of an Antiodroia, not the elimination of tension, but the transformation of tension into music, not the resolution of opposites, but their conscious collaboration, not the achievement of perfect balance, but the dynamic dance of forces that creates life itself. You are no longer at war with yourself. You are finally, gloriously, eternally at home. The moment you cease to be at war with your own shadow is the moment your relationships begin to breathe with an entirely different rhythm. Where once there was the frantic choreography of unconscious projection, that elaborate dance where souls meet not in truth but in the hall of mirrors created by their own disowned aspects, now there emerges something far more sacred, the possibility of authentic encounter between two whole beings who no longer need each other to carry what they refuse to carry themselves. This transformation does not happen overnight, like the sudden illumination of a switched-on lamp. Rather, it unfolds like dawn breaking over a landscape that has been shrouded in fog, gradually, inevitably revealing contours and colors that were always there but could not be seen through the mist of projection. You begin to notice the subtle ways you have been asking others to be the container for your own unlived life, the repository for everything you could not bear to acknowledge within yourself. The lover who triggered your jealousy was never really about their actions. They were the screen upon which you projected your own fear of abandonment, your own sense of unworthiness, your own terror of not being enough. The friend whose success made you bitter was never really about their achievements. They were the mirror reflecting back your own disowned ambitions, your own capacity for greatness that you had buried beneath layers of false humility and fear of your own power. The authority figure whose behavior enraged you was never really about their failings. They were the embodiment of your own inner tyrant, the harsh judge you had never learned to face within yourself. But shadow dancing is not merely about the projections you cast outward. It is also about the roles you unconsciously agree to play in others' psychological dramas. You begin to see how you have allowed yourself to become the receptacle for others' disowned aspects, how you have unconsciously colluded in maintaining elaborate systems of mutual projection that kept everyone safely distant from their own truth. Perhaps you became the difficult one in your family, carrying the anger that no one else was willing to own. Perhaps you became the weak one in your circle of friends, holding the vulnerability that others feared to feel. Perhaps you became the irresponsible one in your relationships, embodying the spontaneity and freedom that your partners had sacrificed for the illusion of control. These roles, once unconscious, begin to reveal themselves as the psychological contracts you never remembered signing. The recognition brings with it a profound shift in the very foundation of how you relate. Where once you approached relationships as a means of completion, seeking in others what you believed you lacked, offering yourself as the solution to their apparent deficiencies, now you begin to approach relationship as a meeting between two already whole beings. This does not mean you no longer need each other. Rather, it means your need arises from choice rather than compulsion, from abundance rather than scarcity, from love rather than fear. The energy that was once bound up in the exhausting work of maintaining false dynamics, the constant vigilance required to keep projections in place, the emotional labor of managing others' disowned feelings, the soul-crushing work of betraying your own truth to maintain harmony, this energy begins to be liberated for something far more nourishing, genuine intimacy. Intimacy, you discover, is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of truth. It is not the elimination of difference, but the celebration of distinctness within connection. When you are no longer afraid of your own darkness, you are no longer afraid of others' darkness. When you have learned to hold your own complexity with compassion, you naturally extend that same spacious acceptance to those you love. Arguments begin to transform from power struggles aimed at proving who is right into collaborative explorations of different perspectives. You find yourself less invested in being understood and more curious about understanding. The desperate need to have your version of reality validated gives way to a genuine interest in the richness of multiple truths existing simultaneously. You begin to notice how much emotional energy you had been spending trying to manage others' feelings about you. The exhausting work of impression management, carefully curating which aspects of yourself to reveal, monitoring constantly for signs of disapproval, adjusting your expression to maintain others' comfort. This work begins to feel not only unnecessary, but actually counterproductive to real connection. In its place arises something both simpler and more challenging, the practice of showing up as you actually are in all your integrated complexity. You discover that when you stop trying to be perfect for others, you give them permission to stop trying to be perfect for you. When you cease demanding that they carry your projections, they naturally stop asking you to carry theirs. This shift reverberates through every relationship in your life. With romantic partners, the desperate clinging of codependency gives way to the secure attachment of two individuals who choose to walk together without losing themselves in the process. Love becomes not a fusion that eliminates boundaries, but a dance that celebrates them, not a merger that creates one being, but a harmony that allows two distinct melodies to create something more beautiful than either could achieve alone. With family members, the ancient patterns of enmeshment and reactivity begin to loosen. You can be in the presence of family dynamics that once triggered you into automatic responses without losing yourself in the familiar chaos. You can offer your truth without needing them to accept it, can receive their projections without absorbing them, can love them without needing to fix or change them. In friendships, the quality of connection deepens as the need for performance diminishes. You can be happy for others' success without it threatening your own sense of worth. You can offer support without needing to be needed, can receive help without feeling diminished. The friendships that were built on mutual shadow dancing naturally fall away, while those based on genuine affinity grow stronger and more nourishing. In professional relationships, you find yourself less reactive to workplace dynamics, less invested in office politics, more focused on your actual work and contribution. The colleague who once pushed all your buttons becomes simply another human being with their own struggles and gifts. Authority figures lose their power to activate your childhood wounds because you have already met and integrated the wounded child within yourself. You begin to understand Jung's profound insight that relationships are not meant to complete us, but to reveal us, to show us the aspects of ourselves that remain unconscious, to offer us the opportunity to reclaim what we have projected, to provide the sacred mirror in which we can see ourselves with increasing clarity and compassion. But this understanding brings with it a new kind of responsibility. When you can no longer blame your relationship difficulties on others' failings, when you can no longer remain unconscious of your own projections, when you can no longer hide behind the roles you have played in others' psychological dramas, then you must take full ownership of your part in every relational dynamic. This ownership is not self-blame, but rather a reclaiming of your power. Every trigger becomes an opportunity to discover what still needs to be integrated. Every conflict becomes a chance to practice staying present with your own truth while remaining open to another's perspective. Every difficult relationship becomes a teacher, showing you where your shadow work is still incomplete. You develop the capacity to recognize projection in real time, both your own and others. When someone reacts to you with an intensity that seems disproportionate to the situation, you can sense that you may have become the screen for their internal movie. Instead of defending against their projection or absorbing it as truth about yourself, you can hold space for their experience while maintaining clarity about what is actually yours to own. Similarly, when you feel an intense reaction to someone else's behavior, you can pause and ask, what is this showing me about myself? What aspect of my own shadow am I seeing reflected back to me? This inquiry becomes not an exercise in self-blame, but a practice of curious self-exploration, a way of using every relationship as a doorway to deeper self-knowledge. The people who remain in your life as you undergo this transformation are those who are also committed to consciousness, to growth, to the difficult and beautiful work of becoming whole. Relationships become laboratories of authenticity, sacred spaces where two people can practice showing up fully without masks, without pretense, without the elaborate defenses that keep souls safely separate. You discover that conflict, when engaged consciously, becomes one of the fastest paths to intimacy. When two people can disagree without withdrawing, can feel triggered without attacking, can be angry without becoming mean, they create between them a field of such safety and spaciousness that both can grow in ways that would be impossible alone. The energy that was once bound in relationship drama, the endless cycles of pursuit and distance, the exhausting patterns of blame and defense, the soul-numbing repetition of familiar fights. This energy becomes available for co-creation, for mutual support of each other's highest unfolding, for the kind of love that doesn't seek to possess, but to liberate, that doesn't demand perfection, but celebrates authentic expression. In the garden of conscious relationship, both people can grow toward the light without competing for resources, can develop their unique gifts without threatening the other's growth, can change and evolve without destroying the foundation of their connection. Love becomes not a fixed state to be achieved, but a dynamic practice to be lived, not a feeling to be maintained, but a choice to be renewed each day. This is the profound gift of shadow integration in relationship. It returns to you the energy that was bound in unconscious psychological contracts, liberates the creativity that was trapped in repetitive patterns, and opens the possibility for connections that nourish rather than drain, that expand rather than contract, that heal rather than wound. You realize that the very relationships that once seemed most difficult were actually the greatest gifts, for they held up the clearest mirrors to show you what needed to be reclaimed within yourself. The people who triggered you most were often your greatest teachers, reflecting back to you the aspects of your own wholeness that you had disowned, rejected, or forgotten. In this recognition, even past relationships take on a different quality. The old resentments begin to dissolve as you understand the unconscious perfection with which souls call each other into growth. The people you once blamed for your pain, you can now see as unwitting allies in your awakening, holding space for the very aspects of yourself that you needed to reclaim. And so the great work continues, but now it is no longer solitary. In relationship with others who are equally committed to consciousness, to wholeness, to the beautiful and sometimes painful work of growing into who they really are, you discover that healing is not only possible, but inevitable. That love is not only sustainable, but endlessly renewable. That connection based on truth rather than projection creates a foundation strong enough to support not just survival, but the full flowering of human potential. There is a moment in the alchemical process when what was once lead reveals itself to be gold, when what seemed destructive unveils its generative power, when the very forces you spent lifetimes trying to suppress suddenly ignite into the creative fire that burns at the center of your authentic expression. This is the moment when your integrated shadow stops being something you have overcome and becomes the very fuel for everything you are meant to create in this world. The raw, primal energy that you once locked away in shame's prison, this wild force that felt too dangerous, too intense, too unacceptable for polite society, now reveals itself as the molten core from which your most authentic creations are born. What you thought was your darkness threatening to destroy your light was actually your light gathering the intensity needed to burn bright enough to be seen, to matter, to make the mark that only you can make upon the world. Jung understood this profound truth, that creativity emerges not from the sanitized realm of conscious intention alone, but from the marriage of opposites, from the conscious dialogue between what we know and what we have hidden from ourselves. The artist who creates only from their acceptable thoughts produces work that feels hollow, technically proficient perhaps, but lacking the vital force that makes art alive. But when creation emerges from the whole being, light and shadow dancing together, it carries a power that cannot be manufactured, an authenticity that cannot be faked. You begin to recognize that your creative blocks were never about lacking talent or inspiration. They were about the enormous energy required to keep your shadow at bay, to create only from the approved aspects of your psyche, to express only what felt safe and socially sanctioned. How exhausting it has been, this constant editing of your own creative impulses, this relentless censoring of anything that might reveal too much, feel too raw, expose too much truth. But now, with your shadow no longer enemy but ally, the floodgates of authentic expression begin to open. The anger you once suppressed becomes fierce passion in your work. The grief you once buried becomes profound tenderness in your creations. The wild joy you once deemed inappropriate becomes the infectious enthusiasm that makes others remember what it feels like to be fully alive. The sexuality you once shamed becomes the sensual appreciation of beauty that infuses everything you touch with erotic aliveness. You realize that what you thought was your dark creativity, the impulses toward work that felt too honest, too challenging, too uncomfortably real, was actually your truest creative voice struggling to be born. Those poems you never wrote because they revealed too much pain, that business idea you abandoned because it felt too bold, that painting you started but never finished because it expressed something you weren't ready to own. These aborted creations were your soul's attempts to birth itself through you. The creative process itself begins to transform, where once you approached your art with the careful precision of someone trying not to make mistakes, now you dive in with the wild abandon of someone who has nothing left to hide. You discover that your best work emerges not when you're trying to impress, or please, or prove something, but when you're simply allowing what wants to be expressed to flow through you without judgment or censorship. This shift brings with it a radical honesty in your creative work. You no longer feel compelled to make everything beautiful in a conventional sense, everything palatable to mass consumption, everything safely within the boundaries of what others might find acceptable. Your work begins to carry the full spectrum of human experience, the messy, the difficult, the uncomfortable, alongside the transcendent and beautiful. You find yourself drawn to creative projects that once would have terrified you, the book that tells the truth about your family's secrets, the painting that captures the raw beauty of your own brokenness, the song that gives voice to the rage you've carried for decades, the dance that embodies the wild freedom you thought you had lost forever. These creations don't emerge from a desire to shock or disturb, but from a deep need to honor the full truth of what it means to be human. The relationship between your conscious creative intentions and the unconscious forces that shape your work becomes less adversarial and more collaborative. You learn to trust the impulses that arise unbidden, to follow the creative threads that seem to lead nowhere logical, to allow your work to surprise you with its own intelligence. The controlling ego that once insisted on knowing where every creative project was heading learns to step back and allow something larger to work through you. You begin to understand that your unique creative signature, the thing that makes your work distinctly yours, emerges precisely from the integration of what you once considered your flaws, your wounds, your unacceptable aspects. The very experiences you once wished you could erase from your history become the raw material for your most powerful expressions. The trauma becomes transformed into compassion, the betrayal into wisdom about human complexity, the loss into appreciation for what remains. This transformation extends beyond traditional artistic endeavors into every aspect of how you express yourself in the world. Your conversations become more creative because you're no longer filtering everything through what you think others want to hear. Your problem-solving becomes more innovative because you're accessing the full spectrum of your intelligence, including the intuitive, irrational, non-linear ways of knowing that you once dismissed. Your very presence becomes more creative because you're no longer performing a role, but authentically inhabiting your own life. The creative fire that ignites from integrated darkness burns differently than the flame of purely conscious creation. It has a wild, unpredictable quality, a depth and intensity that comes from drawing upon the full reservoir of human experience. This fire cannot be controlled in the old way. You cannot simply decide what it will create or when it will burn brightest. Instead, you learn to tend it like a sacred flame, feeding it with truth, protecting it from the winds of others' expectations, allowing it to burn in its own rhythm and according to its own mysterious intelligence. You discover that this creative fire has its own seasons, its own natural cycles of intensity and rest. Sometimes it burns so brightly that you feel almost consumed by the force of what wants to be expressed through you. Other times it settles into quiet embers, gathering strength for the next great burning. You learn to honor both phases, understanding that the fallow periods are not creative failures but necessary regeneration, the shadow's way of composting old material into new fertility. The fear of your own creative power begins to dissolve, where once you might have sabotaged your own success because it felt too dangerous to be fully seen, too overwhelming to take up space in the world. Now you begin to step into the full magnitude of what you're capable of creating. You realize that hiding your gifts serves no one, not you, not those who might be touched by your work, not the world that needs precisely what you have to offer. This doesn't mean the creative process becomes easy or without struggle. If anything, creating from your integrated wholeness often feels more challenging because you're no longer content with superficial expression, no longer willing to create work that doesn't honor the full depth of what you've learned about being human. You develop higher standards, not based on external expectations, but on your own inner knowing of what feels true and alive. You begin to recognize other creators who are working from this integrated place. Their work has a quality of aliveness, of authentic struggle and triumph, that distinguishes it from purely technical skill or conventional beauty. You feel drawn to collaborate with others who are also committed to creating from their whole selves, who understand that the most powerful art emerges from the marriage of light and shadow. The creative community you attract and contribute to changes as well. Where once you might have sought validation from those who could advance your career or increase your visibility, now you find yourself drawn to those who create space for authentic expression, who value truth over polish, who understand that the most important audience for your work is your own soul's need to be expressed. You realize that your creative work has become a form of shadow work itself. Each project an opportunity to discover and integrate aspects of yourself you didn't know existed. Each creation a way of bringing more of your unconscious material into the light of conscious expression. The studio, the page, the stage, these become sacred spaces where the ongoing work of becoming whole can unfold through the act of creation. The products of this integrated creativity carry a different energy than work created from only the acceptable aspects of your psyche. They have the power to touch something deep in others because they emerge from depth in yourself. They can trigger recognition, healing, awakening in those who encounter them because they are born from your own recognition, healing, and awakening. They serve not just as personal expression, but as medicine for a world that desperately needs models of integrated wholeness. You begin to understand your creative work as service, not service to others' expectations or market demands, but service to the larger process of human awakening and healing. Every authentic creation becomes a beacon showing others what becomes possible when we stop hiding from ourselves, when we stop creating from only the parts of ourselves we deem acceptable. The creative fire that burns in you now is not just personal, but transpersonal, not just individual, but archetypal. Through your integrated expression, universal themes find particular voice. The wounds you have transformed become sources of healing for others walking similar paths. The joy you have reclaimed becomes permission for others to rediscover their own capacity for celebration. The power you have integrated becomes inspiration for others to step into their own creative authority. This is the great gift of allowing your shadow to fuel your creativity. Your work becomes not just self-expression, but soul expression, not just personal art, but medicine for the collective wound. The very darkness you once feared would destroy your creative potential becomes the compost from which your most vital and necessary contributions grow. In quiet moments, you feel the profound satisfaction of finally creating from your whole self, of no longer having to choose between authenticity and expression, between truth and beauty, between personal healing and contribution to the world. The creative fire that burns in you now is fed by everything you are, light and shadow dancing together in service of something larger than either could create alone. And in this integration, you discover that creativity is not something you do, but something you are. Not an activity separate from your life, but the very force through which your life expresses its deepest truths. The shadow's raw energy, no longer repressed or projected, becomes the wind that fills the sails of your authentic expression, carrying you toward contributions you never could have imagined when you were creating from only half of who you are. In the deepest chambers of the psyche, where light has never touched and hope seems a foreign concept, there lies shame's ancient kingdom. Here, in this inner underworld, dwell the aspects of yourself you believed were too damaged, too wrong, too fundamentally flawed to ever see redemption. Yet it is precisely here, in this seemingly barren wasteland of self-condemnation, that the most extraordinary transformation awaits, the alchemical miracle by which shame, the shadow's deepest wound, transmutes into wisdom's golden essence. This is not the wisdom of books or teachers, though it may find expression through them. This is not the wisdom of accumulated knowledge or clever insights, though it may inform them. This is the wisdom that can only be born from having descended into your own hell and discovered that even there, even in the places you believed were irredeemable, the light of consciousness can penetrate and transform. This is the wisdom that emerges when the compost of your deepest shame becomes the fertile soil from which compassion grows, first for yourself, then for all beings who walk the difficult path of being human. Shame, Jung understood, is not merely an emotion, but a fundamental organizing principle of the unconscious mind, a tyrant that rules through exile and banishment. It is the voice that whispers, "You are not just wrong in what you do, but wrong in who you are." It is the prison warden that keeps aspects of your essential nature locked away in darkness, deemed too dangerous, too unacceptable, too threatening to the careful architecture of who you think you should be. But shame carries within itself the seeds of its own transformation. Like a snake that must shed its skin to grow, like a phoenix that must burn to be reborn, shame contains within its very structure the potential for its own transcendence. The intensity of shame's grip, the very depth of its wounding, becomes the measure of the wisdom that can emerge from its integration. You begin to recognize that shame has been the shadow behind the shadow, the hidden force that drove you to disown parts of yourself, to project onto others what you could not bear to acknowledge within yourself, to construct elaborate defenses against your own truth. Every aspect of your shadow work has ultimately been about healing shame's fundamental lie, that you are somehow defective at your core, that your essential nature is flawed beyond redemption. The journey from shame to wisdom does not happen through bypassing or spiritually transcending the wound, but through entering it so fully, so courageously, that you discover what lies on the other side of complete acceptance. This requires a quality of self-compassion that may feel almost impossible at first, the willingness to hold with tenderness the very parts of yourself that shame has taught you to despise. You learn to approach your shame not as a prosecutor gathering evidence of your guilt, but as an archaeologist carefully excavating the buried treasures of your disowned humanity. Each shameful memory, each cringe-inducing recollection, each moment of self-hatred becomes not confirmation of your unworthiness, but a doorway into deeper understanding of the human condition itself. The child who was shamed for their neediness begins to understand the profound courage it takes to remain open-hearted in a world that often punishes vulnerability. The adolescent who was shamed for their sexuality begins to recognize the sacred life force that was trying to emerge through them. The adult who was shamed for their failures begins to see the beautiful humanity in being imperfect, in trying and falling short, in being gloriously, messily human. As you tend to these wounded aspects of yourself, with the patience of a master gardener composting last season's decay into next season's fertility, something miraculous begins to occur. The energy that was once bound in shame's prison, the vital life force that was locked away in self-condemnation, begins to transform into something entirely different. The capacity to hold space for others' pain without trying to fix or change it. The ability to offer presence without judgment. The gift of seeing beauty in brokenness. This is how wisdom emerges from shame's compost, not through the elimination of woundedness, but through the transformation of woundedness into medicine. The very experiences that once felt like evidence of your fundamental flaws become the source of your deepest understanding, your most profound gifts to offer a world desperately in need of models of integrated healing. You discover that your shameful secrets, once brought into the light of consciousness, lose their power to tyrannize you and reveal instead their hidden treasures. The addiction that once filled you with self-loathing becomes the gateway to understanding the human hunger for transcendence, the desperate search for something to fill the soul's emptiness. The betrayal you committed that once seemed unforgivable becomes the teacher of humility, showing you the shadow potential that lives in every human heart. The depression that once felt like proof of your brokenness becomes the dark night that taught you to recognize the dawn. The anxiety that once seemed like weakness becomes the sensitivity that allows you to attune to subtleties others miss. The rage that once terrified you becomes the fierce energy that now protects what is sacred, that says no to what diminishes life, that refuses to accept less than truth. Jung's insight into the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious that emerges when opposites are held in creative tension, begins to operate spontaneously in your psyche. Where shame once created only division and self-attack, now there emerges an integrative capacity that can hold both your brokenness and your wholeness, both your humanity and your divinity, both your wounds and your gifts. This integration manifests as a quality of presence that others can feel immediately. There is something deeply restful about being in the presence of someone who has made peace with their own shadows, who no longer needs to pretend to be perfect, who can hold space for the full spectrum of human experience without needing to fix or change it. Your very being becomes a sanctuary where others can begin to explore their own shameful places with less fear, with more compassion. You find yourself naturally drawn to work that involves helping others navigate their own journeys through darkness into light, whether through formal therapeutic roles or simply through the quality of friendship you offer, whether through artistic expression that gives voice to the previously unspeakable, or through leadership that creates safety for others' authenticity. Your integrated shame becomes a bridge that others can use to cross their own rivers of self-condemnation. But this service emerges not from a place of wounded helper syndrome, the compulsive need to heal others as a way of avoiding your own pain, but from the overflow of genuine healing, the natural generosity that arises when you have truly received the gift of self-acceptance. You help others not because you need to be needed, but because you understand intimately the journey from shame to freedom and feel called to light torches along the path. The wisdom that emerges from integrated shame has a particular quality that distinguishes it from other forms of knowledge. It is embodied rather than merely intellectual, tested in the fires of personal experience rather than acquired from books or teachings. It carries the authority of lived truth, the deep knowing that comes from having traversed the territory yourself, from having faced the dragons and discovered they were guardians of treasure. This wisdom manifests as an almost uncanny ability to see through others' facades to the wounded places they are trying to hide, not with the intent to exploit or expose, but with the recognition that comes from having inhabited similar territories of pain. You develop a kind of X-ray vision for suffering, an ability to sense where others are carrying shame and to offer the particular quality of presence that allows them to begin their own healing journey. You realize that every person who crosses your path is carrying their own burden of shame, their own collection of aspects they believe make them unlovable, unworthy, irredeemably flawed. This recognition fills you not with superiority, but with profound humility and compassion. You understand that the human condition includes shame as naturally as it includes breath, that learning to transform shame into wisdom is perhaps the most important work any of us can do. The people who are drawn to you now are often those who are ready to begin their own shadow work, their own journey from self-condemnation to self-acceptance. Your very existence becomes a proof of possibility, a living demonstration that it is possible to emerge from the dark night of the soul, not just intact, but transformed, not just healed, but wise, not just surviving, but thriving. You begin to see shame's hidden purpose in the larger economy of human development. Like pain that signals the body's need for attention and care, shame signals the soul's need for integration and wholeness. It is the guardian at the threshold of authentic selfhood, demanding that you prove your readiness to accept all of who you are before you can step into the full power of your being. The energy that was once consumed by shame's relentless self-persecution becomes available for service to something larger than your personal healing. You find yourself naturally attuned to the collective wounds that humanity carries, the ancestral traumas, the cultural shames, the species-wide patterns of self-rejection that keep us trapped in cycles of projection and violence. Your personal healing becomes a contribution to collective healing. Every aspect of shame you transform within yourself becomes a pathway that others can follow. Every moment of self-compassion you achieve makes self-compassion more possible for everyone. Every time you choose love over self-hatred, you strengthen the morphic field of human possibility, making it easier for others to make the same choice. This is the profound mystery of shame's transformation, that what feels most personal and isolating becomes, through conscious integration, a bridge to universal connection. The very experiences that once made you feel most alone reveal themselves as the common threads that connect you to every human heart that has ever struggled with feelings of unworthiness, inadequacy, or fundamental flaws. You understand now that shame was never really about you being defective. It was about the human soul's deep knowing that we are capable of so much more than we typically allow ourselves to express. Shame, in its twisted way, was pointing toward your unrealized potential, your unlived greatness, your capacity for love and creativity and service that you had not yet claimed. In the deepest irony of the healing journey, you discover that your shameful experiences have become your greatest teachers. Your most wounded places have become your sources of strength. Your most rejected aspects have become your most precious gifts. The compost of shame has indeed become the fertile soil from which wisdom grows, not wisdom as abstract knowledge, but wisdom as lived understanding, as embodied compassion, as the natural emanation of a heart that has learned to embrace its own brokenness and discovered it was wholeness in disguise. And so you walk now as a wounded healer, carrying within yourself the living proof that no shame is too deep for transformation, no wound too severe for healing, no aspect of human experience too dark for love's redemptive light to penetrate. Your very existence becomes a beacon for others lost in shame's labyrinth, showing them that there is indeed a way through, a path from self-condemnation to self-celebration, from the compost of shame to the golden wisdom that emerges when we finally learn to love ourselves with the same fierce tenderness we would offer to any beloved who was suffering. This is the ultimate gift of shadow integration, that your deepest wounds become your greatest wisdom, that your most shameful secrets become your most powerful medicine, that your journey through the underworld of self-rejection becomes the map you can offer others who are ready to undertake their own heroic journey toward wholeness. In loving yourself completely, shadows and light, wounds and gifts, shame and glory, you give permission for the world to do the same. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the long winter of fragmentation finally breaks, not with the sudden violence of spring's first thaw, but with the quiet certainty of dawn itself, inevitable, complete, transformative. You have descended into the depths of your own shadow, wrestled with demons that wore your face, and emerged not unscathed, but whole. The person who once stood divided against themselves now stands as living testament to the possibility of integration. This is individuation's flowering, not merely the resolution of internal conflict, but the birth of something entirely new within the landscape of human consciousness. The self, Jung's profound recognition of the archetype of wholeness, begins to express itself through you with the naturalness of breath, the certainty of heartbeat. You are no longer a collection of warring parts, but a unified being whose every action springs from the fertile soil of integrated completeness. Consider the ancient oak that has learned to draw sustenance not only from the rich earth beneath its roots, but from the infinite sky above its crown. Its strength lies not in choosing between earth and heaven, but in its capacity to bridge both realms, to be simultaneously grounded and reaching. This is the nature of the individuated self, rooted in the concrete realities of shadow integration, yet reaching toward the transcendent possibilities of wholeness. The energy that once scattered itself across 1,000 internal battlefields now flows in a single powerful current. Where there was once the exhausting drama of inner opposition, ego against shadow, persona against authenticity, conscious against unconscious, there is now the quiet efficiency of a river that has found its true course to the sea. This is not the peace of spiritual bypassing or psychological denial, but the dynamic equilibrium of forces that have learned to dance together rather than tear each other apart. You find yourself operating from a center that feels both ancient and newly born. It is ancient because it has always existed within you, waiting beneath layers of conditioning, trauma, and false identification. It is newly born because conscious relationship with this center changes everything. How you move through the world, how you respond to challenge, how you offer your gifts to the collective human story. The self that emerges through individuation is not another identity to be worn like a more sophisticated persona. It is the end of identification itself, the recognition that you are the space in which all identities arise and dissolve. You are the awareness that witnesses the ego's concerns without being consumed by them, the presence that holds both light and shadow without being defined by either. This brings a profound shift in how you relate to your own life story. The narrative of victimhood and triumph, of success and failure, begins to reveal itself as exactly what it has always been, a story, compelling but not ultimate. You become the author rather than the character, the dreamer rather than the dream. This does not diminish the reality of your human experience, but places it within a larger context of meaning and purpose. The paradox of individuation's flowering is that as you become more fully yourself, you become less attached to any fixed idea of who you are. The self that emerges is not a thing but a process, not a destination but a quality of traveling. It is the capacity to meet each moment with the fullness of your integrated being, to respond rather than react, to create rather than merely survive. In relationship with others, this integration manifests as a new kind of love, not the neediness of the wounded ego seeking completion through another, nor the performance of the persona seeking approval, but the recognition of fundamental interconnectedness. You begin to see that the work you have done on yourself reverberates outward in ways both visible and mysterious. Your healing becomes healing for the collective, your integration a gift to the whole. The individuated self does not love from emptiness seeking fullness, but from fullness seeking expression. It does not need to possess or control others, because it has learned to possess and integrate itself. It does not project its shadow onto external enemies, because it has developed the capacity to meet and transform its own darkness. This creates relationships of unprecedented authenticity and depth, connections based not on mutual wounding or unconscious contracts, but on the recognition of shared essence beneath the dance of personalities. In your creative expression, whether through art, work, parenting, or simple presence, the self manifests as a unique signature that cannot be replicated or imitated. This is not the uniqueness of ego that seeks to be different from others, but the uniqueness of essence that cannot help but be itself. Like snowflakes or fingerprints, your particular configuration of consciousness becomes a gift that only you can offer to the world. The creative process itself transforms when working from the center of the integrated self. Instead of creating to prove something, escape something, or fill some void, creativity becomes the natural overflow of wholeness meeting the world. Ideas arrive not through the strain of the thinking mind, but through the receptive awareness that has learned to listen to the deeper currents of inspiration. Work becomes play, effort becomes flow, struggle becomes surrender to something larger than your individual will. This is not to suggest that the individuated life is free from challenge or difficulty. Pain remains pain, loss remains loss. Death remains the great mystery that bookends mortal existence. But your relationship to these inevitable aspects of human experience undergoes a fundamental transformation. You meet difficulty not as a victim of cruel circumstances, but as consciousness encountering the raw material from which wisdom is forged. Suffering, when met from the center of the integrated self, becomes what Jung called meaningful suffering, not the unconscious repetition of old wounds, but the conscious participation in life's deeper curriculum. You begin to recognize that every challenge contains within it the seeds of your further development, every crisis an invitation to a more complete expression of your essential nature. The Antiodroia that once threw you from one extreme to its opposite now becomes a dynamic dance of polarities held in conscious tension. You no longer swing between the extremes of inflation and deflation, but learn to navigate the paradoxical nature of existence itself. You can be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, wise and unknowing, independent and interconnected. The self that emerges through individuation is spacious enough to hold all the contradictions that make up a human life. In your relationship with the collective, your family, community, culture, and the larger human story, you discover that true individuation does not lead to isolation, but to a more conscious form of participation. Having done the work of integrating your personal shadow, you become less likely to contribute to the collective shadow through projection and unconscious reactivity. Having found your own center, you can participate in group dynamics without losing yourself or trying to control others. The individuated person becomes what Jung called a carrier of culture, someone who can hold space for transformation, not only in their own life, but in the collective consciousness. This is not the messianic inflation of believing you must save the world, but the humble recognition that your individual healing contributes to the healing of the whole. Every person who completes their individuation process creates space for others to do the same. You find yourself naturally drawn toward mentoring, teaching, or simply modeling what integrated wholeness looks like in daily life. This happens not through preaching or proselytizing, but through the quiet magnetism of authentic presence. Others sense something different about you, a quality of peace that is not passive, a strength that does not need to dominate, a love that does not seek to possess. The spiritual dimension of individuation's flowering cannot be ignored, though it may manifest in forms that have little to do with traditional religious expression. The self that emerges through shadow integration is inherently sacred, not because it is perfect or pure, but because it is whole. You begin to experience yourself as an expression of the same creative intelligence that moves the stars, grows the forests, and beats your heart without your conscious intervention. This recognition brings with it a profound sense of belonging to something larger than your personal story. Yet, paradoxically, it makes your personal story more meaningful, not less. You are simultaneously a drop in the ocean and the ocean in a drop, unique and irreplaceable, yet part of an interconnected whole whose ultimate nature remains forever mysterious. Prayer, if you engage in it at all, becomes less about asking for things to be different and more about aligning yourself with the deeper currents of existence. Meditation becomes less about escaping the world and more about meeting it with the full presence of your integrated being. Service becomes less about guilt or obligation and more about the natural expression of gratitude for the gift of conscious existence. The flowering of individuation brings with it what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold and synthesize opposites without being torn apart by them. This is perhaps the greatest gift of the individuation process, the development of a center that can remain stable while allowing for the full range of human experience to move through you. You become like a mountain that can weather all storms while remaining essentially unchanged, or like the depths of the ocean that remain calm even when the surface is turbulent. This stability is not rigidity. It is the flexible strength of something that has found its true nature and learned to express it regardless of external circumstances. In practical terms, this might manifest as the ability to remain centered during family gatherings that once triggered you into reactive patterns. It might appear as the capacity to receive criticism without defensive collapse or inflated dismissal. It might show up as the grace to allow others their own process without trying to fix, save, or control them. The individuated self knows how to be alone without loneliness and connected without losing boundaries. It can engage passionately without attachment and surrender deeply without self-abandonment. It has learned the secret that mystics have always known, that the deepest freedom comes not from having no limitations, but from consciously choosing your limitations based on your deepest values and truest nature. As this chapter of your journey completes itself, you may find yourself looking back with amazement at the person you once were, not with judgment or regret, but with the tender recognition of how far you have traveled. The wounded seeker who began this journey has been transformed into the wounded healer, carrying the medicine that can only come from having successfully navigated the path of integration. Yet even as you celebrate this arrival, you sense that it is also a departure. Individuation is not a destination but a quality of traveling, not an achievement but a way of being. The self that has emerged through your faithful engagement with the shadow is not a finished product, but a living process that will continue to unfold, deepen, and express itself in ways you cannot yet imagine. You stand now at the threshold of a new adventure, the adventure of living from wholeness rather than fragmentation, of offering your unique gifts to a world that desperately needs what only you can give. The energy once trapped in internal conflict is now available for creation, for service, for love, for the mysterious work of being fully human in an uncertain world. This is individuation's flowering, not perfection but integration, not the end of growth but the beginning of authentic expression, not the escape from human limitations but the graceful embrace of them. You have become not superhuman but fully human, and in this seemingly simple transformation lies the seed of humanity's own evolution toward wholeness. The self that emerges through this process is both ancient and forever new, both utterly unique and universally recognizable. It is the face you wore before you were born, and the face you will wear when all masks have fallen away. It is who you have always been, now finally free to express itself through the vehicle of your integrated personality. Welcome to the flowering of your own becoming. Welcome to the beginning of life lived from the center of wholeness. Welcome to the gift you have always been, now finally able to offer itself without reservation to the world that has been waiting for exactly what you have to give.